We're going to have a brief discussion about collective intelligence from 4 fascinating perspectives. And I'll just sort of start with a question or 2 for each of you before we then open up into getting a few more from the rest of you. But the obvious starting point with you, Geoff, is to ask the question, what is collective intelligence? What do you want about?
Well, I think what we've been talking about today, for those of you who weren't here, was in part the emerging practice of tapping into large numbers of people's intelligence to either better understand a phenomenon or solve it. And that can range from citizen science projects looking at sort of stars or the state of birds, through democracy projects in 90, 100 cities around the world, allowing citizens to take an active part in shaping policies, to a whole range of tools being used in business to better tap into better ideas and so on. And I think the sort of premise of today is that this field, which isn't particularly new, is really coming of age. It is in some ways the complement to, sometimes in tension with, artificial intelligence, but nearly all the projects we've been looking at use data, use machine learning, use AI of all kinds, but enhancing and enhanced by the human input.
Do you have a sort of favorite example or 2 or something you're particularly inspired by?
We were shown a very old example from the 1900s when there was a collective intelligence project on bird watching. That was nice. That's a reminder how old this field is. But I think the real cutting edge, and probably for a British audience, what was most striking is how fast this field is beginning to transform governance and democracy in some countries, like Taiwan and Korea and Spain and Iceland, some people involved in it in this room, very little of which has yet touched the way we do democracy and governance in the UK, where we sort of use tools like a yes-no referendum as a way to make decisions, rather than these very sophisticated ways of organizing deliberation and thought at very large scale.
Cool. And I'm going to turn from the generalized observations that Geoff's making to the more specific domains that our other panelists are focused on. Starting with Carina, you work in a business school context. So what have you learned from studying how companies are using collective intelligence?
Oh, I have learned many rich insights, actually. I have studied companies and tacit information in companies since 2004. I study this in time series where we run predictions over time. We aggregate information from the front line, from executives, and ask them to predict the future on firm performance. It can be very fuzzy measures such as team performance, identity, culture, or it could be rather observable measures such as financial performance measures. But what we have learned is that the frontline employees in companies, they gather strategic information that is of crucial importance for decision-making in organizations.
Sorry, I have to switch this on and off, but useful insight for all of us working in organizations to make sure they act relatively intelligently. Turning to Bradley, you're occupying in the space of CI tackling social problems, and UNDP works on some of the most complex social problems that exist. What potential do you see for collective intelligence and opportunities?
Well, I think huge. We're just starting to explore this now with Nesta and with this sort of nascent community of practice, but in a couple of ways. So first, the UN development programs. Just a huge organization. It's the UN's lead development agency. So it employs 17,000 people. It's present in 100 countries. So there's all the internal work, and some of the key sort of outputs of UNDP are knowledge products, right? So collective intelligence can really help us internally revolutionize how we help generate ideas and disseminate ideas and create knowledge in a sense. Across governance, human rights, environment, clean energy, but then there's the much more, I think, broader and more interesting aspect of all this is how we can think of the notion of collective intelligence as helping us solve some of the killer development challenges of our time, the Sustainable Development Goals. In a country that country X that wants to adopt clean energy by the next 10 years. How can collective intelligence help us generate more sustainable development solutions in countries? And one of the new initiatives we're working on now, it's kind of still in the proposal stage, is to set up a sort of a global network of social innovation labs in the developing world. And nothing's ever been tried at this scale before, but UNDP kind of has that platform and presence to do it. But we're thinking that collective intelligence can help us really create the ability to scale, the ability to replicate, disseminate knowledge and ideas and potential solutions. So we're looking at it really seriously. We're still kind of new to the game. We want to change the sort of top-down way of doing development work that has been really pervasive for many years, and make it much more sort of diffuse and locally generated through collective intelligence, I hope.
It's great to hear such a contrast of scales on which the question of collective intelligence may operate. You can look at how organizations may function more effectively, and you can look at a much more sort of international kind of range. And there's lots of enthusiasm and interest, at least in this room, for what the potential for collective intelligence can be. And if you've read Geoff's book, you can see that manifesto for possibility is enormous. But there are also sort of potential counterpoints, or at least areas of caution one needs to think of. And if I turn to you, David, to ask a bit about that, because there are these group phenomena such as groupthink or signaling that can follow from the collective, which aren't always necessarily shedding light. Would you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so I think we have to have some consideration alongside collective intelligence, collective stupidity, which there are quite a few examples of as well. And genuinely important question is when does you get one or the other? So lots of distributed information clearly can be used very powerfully, but it can also be assembled in a way which gives you a completely bizarre view of the world. The famous one in the psychology literature, of course, is from groupthink. So you get a group of people and they discuss an issue, and they'll generally reach a view much more extreme than the average position they started with, and the lack of feedback and so on. So when do you get that? Or actually a very interesting example, even if you don't let people discuss and you just ask them, because there's lots of fashionable examples around prediction markets, which are really neat and interesting. But boy, there's a lot of examples where it doesn't look like it works well. So some of you might have read Bobby Duffy's book, just came out, summarizing quite a number of those, and called Perils of Perception. There are very large proportions of the public in many countries who are still completely convinced that there is a link between MMR, jabs, and so on, and autism. There are typically, you'll find, if you ask people you ask the public what proportion of the public are unemployed, you'll get an estimate typically 3 to 5-fold higher than it is. I mean, the Italians, 49%. So the average estimate for Italians, what proportion of Italians do you think are unemployed? It's 49% average, right? Obviously, it's not that high by some margin. Or in Britain, what's the proportion of wealth owned by the top 1%? The British public estimate is 59%. It's about 23%. So does that matter? It does look like it matters. In certain ways, often somewhat predictably, actually, our collective intelligence doesn't look much like intelligence, it looks more like stupidity. The counterpoint, which actually, to be clear, I actually do believe in, I think it's a very interesting set of arguments, is when can you assemble it? So, for example, on the micro level, we're doing some work in Latin America around essentially a notorious example where school kids are given food, and they're kind of filmed with a picture of here's the plate and so on. It kind of went a viral video on this because a teacher filmed it. So the kid gets the food, and then they go out of camera shot. The food is taken away. They're then given a little bit of rice, right, and so on and so on. It's a couple of 100 million program. So we basically designed something which you would probably call collective intelligence, which is essentially using SMS platforms to inform parents about what it is the kids should have been fed, and they are able then, as parents, to collectively say, well, actually, none of our kids got that. And it's really powerful, 43% increase. So we haven't published it, actually. A big increase in the amount of kids' food that they get. Or indeed, deliberative forums. I'm a big fan of it. So, that's a really deep question. When do you get out of this assembling the information, collective intelligence, versus something less appealing?
It is a deep question and a good point well made. And Geoff, you've sort of emphasized along the way throughout today in another context that there ought to be a kind of area of contestation and debate and point and counterpoint rather than sort of a straightforward this is a panacea. But at the same time, I think what you set out in your book is sort of a need for a sort of systematic analysis of the different problem domains and different kinds of approaches so that it can be done really well and take advantage of it. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that question about sort of how to move what is a disparate and varying field forward a bit before maybe we open to the audience.
Yeah, so I think one of the things which has come out of today, and partly helped by SAGE, is thinking about how do we actually structure this much more as a discipline, as a field, which has steadily improving theory, hypotheses, experimental evidence, and so on. And we're looking at creating a journal, a space for the very best researchers, but also linked into practice to bring this together. We've got the best academics from around the world engaged and the best practitioners, and this is highly likely to happen, which I hope will put this onto a different footing. But it will then feed into practice. And just to give one example where I think one could actually run almost a competitive experiment, one of the projects we're working on is about jobs, trying to, at a city level, create a collective intelligence, which means gathering all the data on jobs, skills, pay levels, skills provision, etc., which we're doing for real, and running that as essentially a commons, a knowledge commons, to allow everyone from the teenager to the job seeker to the employer to actually act in the light of a much higher quality of data, analysis, but also predictions on whose jobs are most vulnerable in the next 5 or 10 years. And ideally, you do that in some cities and have other cities as control groups and see over 2 or 3 years which gets both a higher employment rate, higher life satisfaction rates, and so on. And this is, I think, how the field will advance through large-scale, real-time experiments. That's what we're certainly going to try and do.
I like the sound of it, noticing David's right smiling. But, yeah. So I thought we should maybe just go out to the group and hear a bit more from any sort of questions, quick, pithy questions that any of you have. There's one over here. I'll, depending on whether other hands go up in the immediate term, either take 1 or 3. There's a couple, actually, so we'll do 3. Let's start with you.
Hi, Jim Dalton. I wasn't here for the day, so you might have covered this. What's the distinction between collective knowledge and collective intelligence?
Thank you very much. Louis Coiffé from Wonky. Again, wasn't here over the course of the day. Apologies. I'd love to know what you want universities to do in this emerging field.
I joined the question about the difference between collective intelligence and collective knowledge. I would like to add to it, what's the difference with collective intelligence and collective wisdom?
Good 3 questions, many of which tackled very head-on in Geoff's book. Universities to start with, I think. So maybe if you could talk a bit about universities, and then we could broaden it into the question of what is collective intelligence versus collective knowledge versus wisdom or phronesis. So start us off and roll us on.
Yeah, I guess for me, intelligence is not information, knowledge, and wisdom in practice, in use, and learning from doing things. And it's possible to have a lot of fantastic knowledge and not apply it, and that probably isn't what we really mean by intelligence in everyday English. And I guess the vision of the university of the future, and just to sort of give a 30-second summary of a chapter in my book, is really an institution which is embedded in its society, and which is an orchestrator and curator of a range of different kinds of intelligence on everything from cancer to neuroscience to perhaps unemployment. And that probably means a university which is much more willing to draw on all sorts of different kinds of data, from the very formal to the citizen-generated and so on, which is able to move across disciplines, to use the depth of disciplines, but also link them together where necessary to solve problems, and is more willing to be the orchestrator of, say, insight and wisdom, again, from many sources, not just the tenured academics within the walls of the university, but wherever they may be. And I guess one of the big changes of the last 10 or 20 years in all other fields of innovation is this shift from organizations primarily thinking about the intelligence within their boundaries as their primary resource, to everyone from NASA and Facebook to governments developing better tools which harness both data inputs, but also analysis, insight, interpretation from much, much wider communities. There's absolutely no reason why universities couldn't be on the forefront of that. Parts of universities are very engaged, but overall, the university model is still, in some ways, resisting that direction of travel.
Can I just add to this?
Yeah.
Just for the definition of collective intelligence, I would say it's the combination between hardware, software, and a crowd combination of novices and experts, and then you have an independent aggregation mechanism, which is not, considered in when you just define knowledge, or for that matter, collective wisdom. There can be collective wisdom without creating this intelligence that can transform into value for decision making. The wisdom can be there, but it's not transformed into value. So, yeah, that was just to respond to this. Yeah.
Bradley or David?
I'm actually thinking about, we've talked a lot about sort of collective intelligence today, at least examples that from the developed world. And I'd like to sort of urge our panel too, and those out there, to come up with also examples of what's going on in the developing world related to collective intelligence. I can think of a couple in a country where I just recently worked, for example, in Armenia, where there was just recently sort of a quiet revolution, a change of government, and it seemed clear that there was some collective intelligence at work in kind of creating the participatory democracy that led with intention and with technology, and there's this sort of nascent machine learning community there that got involved too. And all of a sudden, with some intention, a couple of weeks later, there was a new government and a whole new kind of democratic movement there. I mean, that's a simpler version of it, but I'd like to start hearing more and maybe urge some research to be done too about collective intelligence in the developing world and how to promote growth, essentially, in a sense.
So Geoff's thought about it a lot more than I have, but actually we're often using a metaphor, of course, we think about it about our own human intelligence when we're using this. So information, knowledge, intelligence, wisdom, what's the difference? Well, look, there's lots of information, for example, throwing to your brain or to citizens all the time, but by itself we don't, like you can feel the toes in your socks, etc., a lot of which you're disregarding. It becomes knowledge, it seems to me, when you contextualize it. So most perception is interpretive, psychologists would say. It's when you so what is it relative to something else? So if I take my Colombian example, you might, of course, the parents got lots of information, they might say to their kids, but it only becomes knowledge when you realize this is what you're supposed to have had, so you contextualize it. It becomes intelligence normally when you combine it in some meaningful way from other sources, you triangulate, and then you can make an intelligent inference. The last twist, interesting question, I don't know what your own answer would be, but I think the gap maybe between from intelligence to wisdom is something not just about what's going on, but how to act. It's about appropriate action being bolted in as well. That's quite a lot of steps to go through, and it requires quite a lot of either machinery in our brains or our societies in order to end up with something which is genuinely wisdom, right?
I'll just throw in also, building on the question about universities and Geoff's point about that, and the fact that Nesta and Sage are looking at launching a journal to help usher in the field, is that it feels like it's almost, to some extent, self-referential. How does a journal adequately represent such a diverse range of disciplines, such a diverse range of communities, to create a relatively good signal of high-quality work in this area out of a really sort of complex terrain? And it does mean that we need to think about sort of incentive mechanisms for people writing articles in the university system, how people build careers and credentials, at the same time the needs of practitioners, and a faster sort of cycle time for contributions to debate. And so it's going to be a fascinating publishing challenge to look at the nature of a journal to meet all the needs that a challenge as complex and diverse as collective intelligence provides. I think we've got maybe time for another quick round, and then we'll close it there. So I see a hand back. There's one. So they're all on this side, except.
So how do you differentiate between collective intelligence and collective bias?
My question kind of comes from the artificial intelligence space. So there's a debate there about whether they should be pursuing a general artificial intelligence. Maybe Jan LeCun holds that position, and others kind of see the purpose of the field to discover artificial intelligences, so that there's a patchwork of artificial intelligences. I wonder if that same question is analogous and helpful in our field. Are we looking for a general collective intelligence, or are we expecting to find a lot of collective intelligence systems that are applicable in narrower domains?
Let's take the third and fourth. This is our last round.
Hi. Apart from developing or implementing service design, how can large businesses or large organisations or sectors, the private sector, respond to or use the tools of collective intelligence for their social purpose? Do you have any examples?
I'm in health and social care, and listening to what I've heard so far, my question is, how will AI and collective intelligence be able, because it's very much based on rational knowledge, how will it be able to integrate and validate the best of empirical, intuitive, traditional, and intuitive knowledge? Where does that come in? Because that's also that would also include the less developed world.
An excellent mind-stretching range of questions for the panel to close out on. So let's start with the sort of rationality bias end of it that David, I think, was clocking on the first question, and go through artificial general intelligences through to service design examples into local knowledges. And let's start with David, and then let's see how creatively you can each pick up and link from there.
Sure. So look, obviously we spent a lot of time thinking about biases, mental shortcuts, and maybe a more forgiving. We're all humans. In some of them, social proof is an obvious one. You know, we go with the crowd, what everybody else is doing, and that can be a pretty good cue if everybody's running for the door. Maybe there's a reason they're all getting out. But sometimes it can be, of course, completely misleading, and we may not be able to distinguish those. How do you get behind it? To be a bit boring for a second, my own view is that it gets to often questions of where you see where you're likely to make errors, and you can try and anticipate that. So you can look at framing and distortions and so on. So if a Bank of England is putting out information, you actually want, are people correctly interpreting or whatever it would be? But ultimately what you really do is you look behind the claim. So what was the method that gave rise to the claim, and is it likely to be biased? And boring but mega important, certainly in the policy world, right? What's the difference between an anecdote, etc., as opposed to a randomized controlled trial where you really tested it? And most people aren't really aware of that difference. It's absolutely key. Just last bit, one of my favorite studies of recent years was this great trial done in Uganda. It was done actually for medical reasons around, we have folk beliefs. So in fact, one of the examples was, if you have a cut, do you literally put cow shit in it, which is a folk belief. Turns out it's a bad idea, by the way. And what they did, the intervention was, could you teach kids to recognize when someone makes a claim, like, we think this is true, and then how you would probe and look behind it. They rather quaintly called it, could you teach kids, or indeed parents and teachers, to be better bullshit detectors? And it turns out you can. And it's really effective as a program. I mean, really good materials and so on. So I think it is possible on all those levels that we talk about information and knowledge, etc., to try and put in some kind of checks and balances to make it veer towards something which is useful and intelligent, as opposed to nuts and, we've gone the wrong way. But it can be damn hard to see it, if you don't get that design right. Really critical, of course.
Anyone else like to chip in on any of the questions?
I can just add that to that, because in the organizations, when we test this tacit information aggregation, whether it's valid, whether there's bias in it, we always link to financial firm performance or financial measures to actually assess if there is a link between the tacit information and financial firm performance. So we must conclude that if there is this link, there's not bias in it as such at the aggregated level, if it can explain fluctuations in the economy or in financial measures.
Yeah, please.
So a couple of comments. First of all, I think it's clear in any field of collective intelligence there are enemies and threats. Bias, misinformation, deliberate underminings of all kinds. And one of the reasons we've called the new Centre for Collective Intelligence Design, picks on what David said, is you have to get into the quite detailed design of processes to avoid those threats. So the design of meetings. If you, for example, just do large public meetings, that's often the worst way to capture the intelligence of a crowd, because the loud-mouthed, extroverts may completely dominate and take you in the wrong direction. Online, we've been hearing today about the really good online examples, which are designed in exactly the opposite way from Twitter. Again, so they force people to be thoughtful, deliberative, and not shout and troll. But this is where the craft skills of collective intelligence are crucially important and need to be cultivated. And then the second point I want to make is really trying to weave a few of these points together. Last year, we did quite a big project on data-driven farming in the Indian subcontinent. Now, that's a good topic where you can imagine a quite near-term future where for groups of farmers in an Indian state, their work becomes much more like a collective intelligence, where they are gathering data on crops, including from satellites, and also sort of intuitive experiential knowledge. They are using AI algorithms to make predictions about what a particular drought or rainfall might do to particular crops. But they're also linked horizontally, so they can rapidly share experiences about what is working or what isn't, and so on. And in a sense, again, the collective intelligence design question is how can you turn 1,000 or 100,000 farmers in that field into something which reflects the way our own brains work at their best, which is linking observation, analysis, prediction, memory, and so on. Now, in relation to the general versus specific question, lots of that will be very specific to how farming works and very specific to a context. But I guess we're fairly sure that some of the elements of that design will be not dissimilar to the National Health Service, or how you turn a school system into a collective intelligence, or how you get a parliament to operate as if it was a collective intelligence. They will always have some element of, say, data and observation, analysis, reflection, interpretation, learning loops, and so on. And although we wouldn't want to claim, yet there is a CGI, whatever it is, general intelligence, there is a huge amount of cross-pollination to be achieved between different fields. And again, that's the justification for a journal which is deliberately cross-disciplinary, and for our centre, which is trying to develop the practical craft design skills applicable in many different contexts.